Welcome. It's a pleasure to come and speak with you about platforms. There are huge changes afoot in the economy. And what I want to do is to give you both the facts of what's happening, why I think some things are so different, and the definitions and how you can anticipate the problems and perhaps even adapt in banking. So let's start with three ideas. The first of these ideas is that giant firms are emerging in the internet era, just like those in the industrial era. But in this case, it's for the opposite reason. The second thing I want to point out is that platforms beat products in any market where both of them compete. One interesting thing that happens is that platforms appreciate in value, whereas products depreciate in value through usage. Something about network effects causes this to happen. And then, of course, you can predict your role. We can, in fact, design this and anticipate where we can perform within the economy. Let's take a look at the most famous companies in the world. Every October, Interbrand produces a list of the 100 most famous companies in the world, and here are the top 30 or so. What's fascinating is that 13 of the top 30 are in fact platform companies. And if you take a look at who is trying to become platform companies, we even see that this is the case even for firms like Toyota or Honda and Siemens and industrial firms like GE. It's not just Apple and Google and others in there, American Express, others also in this marketplace. The next thing I'd like to point out is the relative value. Most of you might know, of course, that 7 of the top 10 most valuable firms in the world today are platform companies. What might be less obvious is if you simply roll back a decade, that wasn't true. It gives you some idea of how fast things are changing. Traditionally, the most valuable companies in the world have been in energy and banking. It makes sense. These are the things that really drive economies, energy and banking. What we really should be paying attention to is how much information is now driving the economy. But it's not just the resource, it's also the business model. To drive that point home, let's take a look at the next slide, which really shows how fast things are changing if we look at comparative industries. So compare, for example, BMW to Uber, or Marriott to Airbnb, or Facebook to Walt Disney. One, you notice how fast things have changed. It's only a relatively short time frame for the platform firms. The most important point to here is the value that's created per employee. In fact, if you take a look at the ratio of value per employee, it's vastly higher for Uber than BMW or Airbnb or Marriott. In fact, the ratio of the platform firms to the non-platform firms is about an order of magnitude. I want to draw your attention to also how the value is being created. In the case of Uber, third parties create the rides, or Airbnb, third parties create the rooms, or in the case of Facebook, you and I create that content as compared to Walt Disney that hires it. This will bring us to the concept of an inverted firm, where value is created outside the organization. Say one more, take a look at other points of data on this. If you take a look at the economy as a whole, the 7 most valuable firms count for, in oil, 1.5 trillion in value, in banking, about 1.7 trillion in value, and platform firms, about 3 times that. It is extraordinary how much value is there. Or even take a look at the resilience. For example, take a look at this information provided by the Financial Times about 6 months after COVID hit. The firms that were really hit were industrial firms, banks, and other traditional energy companies. You can see here most of them lost market capitalization. But if you take a look at the platform firms, they gained market capitalization. It's quite extraordinary what seems to be happening. Their resilience is better. And you think about it, when the Marriott actually has rooms sit idle, Airbnb has none of those carrying costs. It's something that's quite different. Let's go to take a look at what happened in the industrial era and compare that to today. The giants of the industrial era occurred in electricity, in automotive, in oil, in energy, in railroads. All of these were driven by supply-side economies of scale, massive fixed costs, low marginal costs. That's not what's happening in the internet era. Take a look at the internet era, where we can take a look at things like mobile operating systems, where Microsoft still has 90% market share. Or we take a look at Google, which has 87% market share in mobile operating systems. Or Facebook, with 3 billion users. Or something like WeChat. Their systems are so dominant in society that even beggars take WeChat Pay rather than cash. It's extraordinarily how penetrating this is. These are driven by network effects. Partners creating value for other partners, or users creating value for other users. Economists call this a demand-side economy of scale. And take a quick look at what's happened just in a standard economics chart. Well, supply economy of scale, You lower your costs, so you lower your prices, which gives you volume, which kills the competition, which gives you volume, which lets you lower your prices and kill the competition. On the internet side, demand economies of scale, users create value for users, which attracts users, which creates value, which attracts users. It's the opposite side of the profit equation. It's the revenue side rather than the cost side. This leads to fundamentally profound changes, not just in the nature of the economy, but in the nature of all organization. I teach in a business school, and I assert everything we teach in business school changes. What happens is you need value-creating activities outside the firm, just as analogous to those that we used to do inside the firm. And the reason's quite simple. You cannot scale network effects inside the firm as easily as outside the firm. There are simply more people outside the firm, more partners, more resources outside the firm. You take a look at just a few examples here. In finance, you have to value the resources of the community, the external. This explains, for example, why Facebook bought Instagram for $1 billion. So if we take a look at IBM trying to buy Red Hat, or Microsoft trying to buy LinkedIn, or Skype, these are external communities that have to be valued. Or human resources shift from employees to external crowds. R&D, from your own innovation to open innovation. Or information technology, from back office systems to front office systems to out of office social systems. Operations and logistics, third parties bear the marginal costs. It's done outside. You have zero marginal costs of production. Strategy is particularly telling. We've gone from barriers to entry to permissionless entry for production and consumption. You want as many parties coming into your ecosystem as possible to help create value. Amazon wants merchants in its ecosystem. Uber wants drivers in its ecosystem. This fundamentally changes the strategy of an organization. To give you a simple illustration that should be familiar, take a look at least a dozen products that have had their sales erased by Android and iPhone. You take a look at GPS systems, or cameras, or fitness trackers, or e-readers, or day planners. This creates serious problems for the traditional tenets of strategy. The first of these problems is, how do you build a barrier to entry at a boundary you cannot define? A day planner doesn't look like a calculator, which doesn't look like a camera, which doesn't look like an MP3 player. These are different and overlapping. The second point, which I'll come back to in just a moment, is you don't have to control all of the resources. A third party can do it for you. Evernote wiped out Filofax. That Apple did it without even trying. A third party did it. Third parties bring the resources into the ecosystem. To look at this differently, you can predict the dangerous entrants are those that bring their own and larger ecosystem. This is why Apple crushed BlackBerry when it moved into its ecosystem, or why Google might be so dangerous as it moves into banking and finance, because it has an ecosystem. As their developers come into their ecosystem, they create a feedback effect that's positive on their platform, which diminishes the feedback on your own platform. There's also a fundamental difference in insight that I'd like to emphasize, which is it is far easier to add a technology to a community than it is to add a community to a technology. Let me see if I can give you an illustration. I'm not sure if you can see this well, but here is a Hewlett-Packard calculator, right? This is, hoping that you can see this. There you go. This is a Hewlett-Packard calculator. It was not produced by Apple or by Google or Hewlett-Packard, and yet it's a free product, or 99 cents, and it wipes out the sales of Hewlett-Packard. What's fascinating is, think of it in the following way. How easy is it for Google to add that to its ecosystem? Trivial. They did it without even trying. A third party did it for them. By contrast, how hard is it for HP to add a community to its calculator? That's hard. That's essentially really difficult. The community is, in effect, the asset in this case. And again, I emphasize, it's far easier to add a technology to the community than it is to the community to the technology. Well, this brings us to the definition of a platform. Digital transformation alone is not a platform. A platform has to have, in effect, three properties. So we like to define a platform as an open architecture with rules of governance to facilitate interactions. Each component matters. Here again, remember, products have features, platforms have communities. The open architecture is what allows third parties to come in and attach and add value to the ecosystem. The governance is what motivates them to come and join the ecosystem. You want people you don't know to bring you ideas you don't have, and it's your governance model that rewards them for doing that. The third component is the interactions. It's that transaction interaction that actually creates the value. And innovation means nothing if you don't transfer it to somebody else. So you have to have that exchange concept or the interaction that takes place. So all of these things matter. This brings us to a few elements of why the mental model is so challenging or so hard. Let's see if I can illustrate this with a few different concepts. Now, the first one is particularly germane for finance. The first question one almost always tends to ask in finance is, how do we make money? What's the profit maximization strategy? That is absolutely the wrong first question to ask. In fact, look at these examples. BillPoint, MySpace, AOL Instant Messenger, and Adobe. They all started by trying to make money first, as opposed to creating value first. In fact, the first question that must be asked is how do we create value rather than how do we take value? And especially it's the case if third parties are creating this value on your behalf, you can't be taxing their participation until you understand what value they're bringing to the ecosystem. So it's essential. The first question is how do we enable value creation, especially by third parties, before we tax that value? The second point, often for the lawyers, is it's not just about risk minimization. The economists at least know minimizing risk is not maximizing value. Here we have several examples. IBM Watson pushes the risk onto its ecosystem partners, and it has stayed small. Houghton Mifflin has done this in terms of certifying its education systems. A wonderful example is in credit cards. In the United States, as they were first introduced, users were not insured against fraud. One senator sought to try to make the banks cover the fraud, and the banks screamed saying this was a terrible idea. Why? Because you'd introduce moral hazard. People would be careless and there would be more fraud on the card. Over the objections of the banks, the legislation passed. What happened? It wasn't more fraud. It was more transactions volume, more usage. Now the banks indemnify users against all fraud as long as they report it in the first 24 hours. Why? Because they want them using their credit cards. Again, the insight here is to absorb that level of risk that pulls interactions onto your platform. That is the issue. If we take a look at the platforms, all of them have taken this growth strategy first. You create value before you take value. There's a really deeper insight, which is create more value than you take. If you do this, people will bring you value. They will invest alongside you. You'll create a larger external ecosystem. There's a cautionary note. I'll give you several quick examples. Too many businesses have thought that they could collect the tolls. They sat astride a flow of value and simply able to collect the value. That is the wrong way to think about building a platform. Because on a platform where third parties create the value, they will simply route around you. We have multiple illustrations of this. If we take a look at long distance telephone calls, they charge immense, the telecommunications companies charged immense amounts. Skype came in with a data packet and went around them. Same thing with text messaging. They used to charge immense amounts per message. WhatsApp charged $1 a year and used the data service. Banking used to be safe in China. You needed government approval to enter and high loan origination costs. Alibaba buys a bank, gets it, and then uses its transactions market to have lower cost loans. We'll come back to that in a moment. Then take a look at taxi medallions. That is a legislated monopoly protecting the market so that they had these really high costs. Matter of fact, the prices of medallions in New York City were approaching $900,000. And then Uber makes a car look like a taxi and perform it, and the taxi value plummets. You must add value, not simply take tolls. Again, telcos, banks, taxi cab companies all were regulated and thought they were secure, and they were not. You have to add value rather than take taxes. I'd like to be able to help you anticipate industries that will change and what your role can actually be. So let's take a look at when industries change. Here's a checklist of when businesses transform into platforms. In effect, each of these is simply a different version of the basic insight I gave you a moment ago, which is the property of the inverted firm. That is, each of these is a test for how easily third parties can create value on your behalf. The first of these is what's the proportion of value that's information-based. The higher the proportion of information as opposed to tangible assets, the easier it is to spread that value over larger numbers of people and share that. That is why news and software and video has transformed so rapidly. Another is how precise, fine-grained, or modular is it that a third party can add value to the ecosystem? A ride, a tweet, a stay, a video, it's easy to add value. By contrast, an aircraft is so complex, even a company like Boeing can't even necessarily get it right. Complexity means a single organization has to do it. You would never crowdsource an aircraft. A third is risk from experimentation. Is it safe for third parties to experiment? This, by the way, is one of the reasons why healthcare has not transformed as rapidly. It is a heavy information business, but it's heavily regulated and it's risky. Similarly with banking. It is more risky and it is more regulated, so it's going to transform more slowly. If you flip that, you can see you do not open APIs on pacemakers or nuclear power plants. You could kill people, could introduce malice in those cases. So absorbing that risk may help that transformation. It's another way to predict it. This last one is spare capacity. How easy is it to take a physical asset and share it with others? For example, if an MRI machine is expensive or only used 40%, you can time slice it and actually have third parties use that resource. There's a firm in Boston doing exactly that. In banking, loans are the same thing. It's money that's sitting idle and you're reusing it. By contrast, high utilization assets, a surgeon, a piece of perishable fruit, you cannot reuse that. You can't use that as a marketplace. Again, each of these is a test for how easily you can invert the firm. This brings us to the question, what should your role be? Do you have the right to become a platform? If platforms always win, can you succeed in that industry? The question then becomes, first, is it the marketplace going to transform? This is the test we just gave you. Then, can you be the platform, or are you going to have to partner for the platform, or are you doomed to be a product or service on someone else's platform? Here's a decision tree that helps with that process. The first of these is that's the test of the firm inversion. The second two critical tests are, one, do you have the resources to tip the marketplace? Can you achieve critical mass in network effects? Two, do you have control of the customer relationship? Can you reach through and actually control the interaction that creates value? If the answer to both of those questions is yes, then absolutely, you should be racing in these winner-take-all markets to become the platform. If the answer to either of those questions is false, you may be able to partner and create a federated platform. We see this in Hulu for content, which is a response to Netflix. We see this, in the case of banking. It's kind of interesting, where Visa is a consortium of member banks. It was set up to compete with MasterCard. Is another way to do that. A federated platform may be a possibility. If you can't create a partnership, then you're doomed to be a product on someone else's platform. So this gives you a decision tree as to where you might be. This brings us to the last set of ideas, just to summarize what we've covered. The first is we are in fact seeing a major transition in the economy. This is not a fad. This is not something that's going to happen. Demand economies of scale are going to be with us always, just as supply side economies of scale are with us always. We're seeing the emergence of gigantic firms of antitrust size proportion, just like we saw a century ago. The reason for this is network effects, is partners or users creating value for one another on the demand side. This changes fundamental structure of organizational form. It leads to inverted firms where value is created outside, not just inside. That means a whole new raft of management practices. This is not simply digital transformation. It is the case that platforms beat products in any market where the two compete. It's very simple. Because of network effects, platforms appreciate through use where products and services, products depreciate through use. You can also think of the product transformation, and you understand the inversion. So you can predict where it is, and you can actually see where the role is based on your ability to control and interact with other users outside your ecosystem. And of course, banking and finance will transform. They've been a little bit slower to transform than software and video and news, but because it is such an information-intensive industry, there's no question that this will be the platform business model of the future. So thank you for your time. We'll hope to look forward again in future. Thank you.